In the 1880s, Britain moved into Burma, which is today called Myanmar, and to the Malay Peninsula, Malaysia today. So they pretty much controlled the huge arc of territory from what is now Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Burma, and down into the Malay Peninsula. So most of Asia, South Asia, was in British hands. The French were in what is now Vietnam, which was called French Indochina then. The United States, seeking to liberate Puerto Rico and Cuba from Spanish control, they were still Spanish-owned islands, went to war with Spain in 1898 and occupied Cuba and then controlled Puerto Rico and the Philippines, took them away from Spain. Cuba quickly gained its independence, but the United States remained in Puerto Rico and Philippines for some time. We are still in Puerto Rico, and we stayed in the Philippines until the Japanese took them away from us during World War II. Slides show some more of the chronology of the new imperialism in Asia, beginning in the 1840s. This slide shows more events, imperial events of the 1870s, 80s, into the 20th century. And this slide is a link to a Google Earth video voyage to show how far the colonists, the colonial imperialists, had to travel and were willing to travel and settle, heading out to acquire more territory. So this video follows a path from the seaport of London down to South Africa and over to Japan, and mentions some of the lands in between. A color-coded map showing the territory acquired by the various colonial powers. As I mentioned, this large arc of control by the British from what is Pakistan today, India, Bangladesh, Burma, and the Malay Peninsula. The orange is French area in what is the Vietnam and Cambodia. The U.S. in blue here in the Philippines. Japan had moved over into parts of China, into Korea as well. So Japanese had occupied Korea. Or the British were in Australia as well. So besides acquiring Puerto Rico and the Philippines in 1998, the Americans decided to acquire Hawaii from the native people there for sugar plantations. The Hawaiians had no military force and couldn't resist when the U.S. Navy showed up to support sugar planters who simply took over the land and claimed it for themselves. In 1916, the Virgin Islands, which had been claimed by Denmark, were sold to the United States. They still remain U.S. territory. Virgin Islanders are citizens. A number of them have been students at Seton Hill University in the past. However, they cannot vote in U.S. presidential elections. They do elect a non-voting member of the House of Representatives. At this time, it's time to think about causes of the new imperialism. And one cause is the continuing appeal of nationalism, which involves a love of your own country and an identification with that country, and hoping that the country will become more powerful. It's my country, I want it to be bigger and stronger and better. And acquiring other territory makes me feel better about my country, makes me prouder of my country, and also brings in resources that can help our economy. So feelings like that, simply nationalist pride, are one explanation for the extension of European power throughout the globe. Others are more practical. Other reasons given include the desire to maintain a military balance of power against other countries by being able to sail around the world with your now steam-powered fighting ships, and as well as trading ships. And a steamship burns a lot of coal in the steam engines to fire up the boilers. The coal is burned to boil water, which produces steam, and the steam pressure drives the pistons of the big steam engines. And when you run out of coal, if you're in the middle of the ocean, what are you going to do? Well, the first steamships had sails as well, but the later steamships came to depend completely on coal for their power, and so they had to be able to resupply themselves when coal got low. And so coal depots were set up around the globe and in islands in the middle of the ocean, so that you go halfway across the ocean, pull into a coaling station in Hawaii, and refuel your ship and have enough to get all the way to the Philippines, where you could fuel up again with more coal, and then sail over to India and so on. Another reason, there's two more reasons here on this slide that are very similar. Hobson's explanation of surplus capital and Lenin's theory about preventing class warfare. Hobson argued that the industrial countries were producing so much wealth, and when wealth is accumulated, it needs to be reinvested in order to produce more wealth. But the problem is the new investment in England and the United States, new factories and so on, would increase an output beyond what the people could afford to buy. And so it runs into a problem, a contradiction, that they're producing too much and the people can't use up all that is being produced. So the answer is, well, take your surplus and sell it around the world. So you can take your excess capital and invest it in Africa somewhere, and you will be able to sell goods made in England or wherever in Africa, and you'll also be able to maybe have a diamond mine or whatever to bring in wealth from Africa back to Europe. So the need to invest surplus capital was an economic problem that was being solved, Hobson was arguing, by creating colonies abroad. And Lenin, the theorist of the Russian Revolution, had a similar argument. But his argument was somewhat different. Marx illustrated the problems of workers in industrial Europe, that as industrialization proceeded, the workers weren't benefiting. They were living in miserable conditions. There was rampant poverty. And the reason is that the companies were competing with one another for sales. And in order to compete, they needed to lower their prices to be more attractive. And if you lower your prices, you're going to cut out your profits. So in order to maintain profits, instead of reducing profit, they cut prices and then cut wages of workers in order to maintain some profitability. So that means the more competition that occurred between the industrialists of Europe, the lower workers' wages tended to be. How do we solve this dilemma? Because if wages go too low, if they reach the point of misery, immiseration, I should say, is what Marx called it. If they reach the point of immiseration, workers will have no reason not to rebel, no reason not to revolt, because they've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. They're on the edge of complete collapse, economic collapse. Well, the answer is to be found, again, in colonies. The colonies provided very cheap resources. The rubber for the automobile tires and so many other uses that were found for rubber could be acquired at virtually almost no cost. The natives were simply enslaved. If they didn't work in Belgium, the Belgian colony of Congo, they simply cut off their hands as a lesson to others who wouldn't work. And they reinstituted slavery, essentially. And so this great profit that could be attained from the resources of the third world meant that they could afford to raise wages back home. Profits were so great that they could share some of it with their workers. So Lenin's argument is that the profitability of colonies, the cheapness of resources, prevents class warfare at home and maintains the peace. And that's a motivation for having colonies and getting those cheap resources. This slide probably should have been included earlier, but it illustrates the phrase, the sun never set on the British Empire. See, the British territory is illustrated here in green on this map. And so wherever you are, here's British Honduras and the Boot of Mexico, Canada, British Guiana, all the British territory across Africa, Great Britain itself and Ireland, India, which included Pakistan and Bangladesh, Burma, Malaysia, the British East Indies in Borneo, the island of Borneo, Australia and New Zealand. So wherever the sun was shining, below that was territory owned by England. One more explanation for imperialism needs to be addressed, and that's the romantic ideal of white man's burden. This comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling by the same title. And in it, the poem reads, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed." It was a burden that the white men of Europe were required to shoulder because they were good Christian men and needed to go and help the uncivilized heathens of the rest of the world. And so colonization was seen as a generous act by the white men of Europe. It was a burden that they had to carry. It was heavy because the people in these countries wouldn't appreciate them. No matter they travel miles from home, still their self-sacrifice just wasn't recognized by the African and the Indian and so on. And so it's a burden. You're not going to be appreciated, but you have to do it because that's the kind of person you are. So white man's burden was widely accepted by Europeans, particularly by the British, as Kipling himself was a British colonial administrator in India primarily. He's known for popular things like the Jungle Book stories, that Disney has made into contemporary movies. Teddy Roosevelt was often an advocate of this particular theory. And the poem was widely read and widely published around the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s. And one more theory is social Darwinism. Darwin had published The Origin of Species and promulgated the idea that some species are more fit to survive and those who are unfit disappear. They don't reproduce, they become extinct. And this led to a kind of a distortion of Darwinism, what is called social Darwinism. This is not the same as Darwinism. but it's related to it. And it's the notion that stronger people have a right to conquer weaker, inferior people because the stronger people are genetically superior. How do we know they are? Well, they wouldn't be stronger if they weren't. So this kind of ignores the accidents of history and industrialization and so on. But the ultimate argument for social Darwinism is that controlling and regulating and overthrowing the uncivilized peoples of the world will improve the human race. An image from Africa that enabled European peoples to think of themselves as so much superior. Think of the Victorian mansions that many of the wealthy industrialists lived in compared to this little straw hut in Africa, and with cattle grazing right outside your door. The primitive versus the civilized. Cape Town was a thriving British colony because the climate at the lower part of Africa was a temperate climate, so the Europeans could feel very comfortable there. Finally, what were the consequences of European imperialism? One consequence was that these areas acquired their independence after World War II. The colonies, European states could not hold on to their colonies after World War II. The United States lost the Philippines, even though it still holds Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Guam and the Virgin Islands. India got its independence from Britain. Pakistan was born, Bangladesh, Burma got its independence, and so on. So what happened afterwards is that the conflict after World War II was between the two superpowers, the nuclear powers, Russia and the United States. That should be the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, and the United States, the USA, the United States of America. One representing the West, the capitalist industrial might of the West, and the notion of free markets and so on. And the other representing a competing power, striving to industrialize, to move from a feudal era. When the Russian Revolution began, they were still a feudal state, 1917. Rapidly industrializing, becoming so powerful so fast that they could actually pose a danger to the very powerful USA. Each of those two sides in that conflict pressured the newly independent countries of the southern part of the globe, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, pressuring them to be allies. And this tended to distort their natural development. They have this pressure from these very powerful states, forcing them to take sides in what could be the future nuclear war. Another consequence was the sense of superiority of the colonizers and the inferiority among those dependent populations. There is still an economic dependency among many of the poorer countries of the world. They depend on trading partnerships and so on. Even though those don't yield very many benefits for them, most of the benefit from international trade goes to the powerful industrial countries. And there's still a net transfer of wealth from the poor countries to the rich countries, despite any foreign aid that might take place. The net transfer is from the poor to the wealthy. Besides a sense of inferiority, there's a loss of cultural heritage. In many of these countries, people see that it is the whites who have the wealth. It is the white culture that they start to mimic and aspire to be like, which leads to a lessening or devaluing of the native cultural heritage in those areas. Ethnic conflicts. I'd like you to watch a little video that shows how the ethnic conflicts of today, the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, are a direct result of how the colonists divided the lands of Africa and other places and set the peoples into conflict with one another by the relationships that they engendered. Another consequence is the continuing depth of poverty and misery in these parts of the world. And that ends the slide lecture, but I want you to be sure to watch the video components as well.